Hello and welcome to Operating Cost Reduction. Be your own consultant. Brought to you by Plexus International. We are excited to have you all online today to cover operating cost reduction topics and steps you can take back to your organization. You may notice that you are on mute for this presentation. This is to maximize the experience and to minimize distractions. If you're having technical difficulties, I invite you to use the chat feature, chat out to the panelists, and we'll make sure that we can take care of you one-on-one. At times during the presentation, it may be necessary for you to interact with us. The raise hand feature allows you to be able to interact with some of our questions by showing a show of hands or something of that nature. You can interact with us here. The Q&A feature is for if you're having questions along the way. If you have course-related questions, we invite you to put them in here as we will have a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Please watch for a few polls as your responses are helpful for us to gauge your understanding and participation in this webinar. There'll be breaks. This actually, I apologize. This may not apply for this particular seminar, but as far as the Q&A feature, you can put questions that you're having about the course material into the Q&A feature, and at the end, we'll answer those questions live. If you're having technical difficulties, you can reach out to me, your moderator, via the private chat. Today we have Plexus instructors and coach and author Jeremy Hazel and CEO of Automotive Industry Action Group, AIAG, J. Scott Charlin. Enjoy your experience.
All right, folks, and welcome to Operating Cost Reduction. My name is Jeremy Hazel, and I'm here with J. Scott Charlin there, and we're going to be talking to you for the next hour about the strange mix of both finance, quality, and how to kind of survive, how to kind of think about the next year, and what you can do actionably in order to take your business from potentially more volatile than it needs to be into a state of better predictability through reduction of operating cost. So what we're going to do first, I'm going to introduce myself. My name is Jeremy Hazel. And as Cece said there, I'm an author, a trainer, a coach for Plexus International. And my specialty largely is in small team dynamics and as well as risk-based thinking. The third book that I put out in the industry was all about strategic planning, risk-based thinking. I got my master's degree in value-added quality management, but I got my undergraduate degree in corporate finance. So while I might have had a career up to that point in quality, once I figured out the financial piece and I realized that those two weren't talking, I've spent a majority of my life trying to blend those two fields. And so this seminar is the perfect joining, let's say, of the financial side and the more theoretical quality side in a time where it probably has never been more critical to put one eye on each field. So, Scott, would you like to introduce yourself there before we get started?
Thanks, Jeremy, and welcome all. As Jeremy just said, my name is J. Scott Charland. It's my privilege to lead the Automotive Industry Action Group as its CEO. It's my great pleasure to be with you here this afternoon. In terms of background, 30 years in industry, starting in the raw materials businesses, moving into manufacturing, electrical electronics, plastics, stamping, molding, decorate, assemble, and for the last 15 years, cat herding here at AIG, trying to drive performance improvements and more predictable manufacturing outcomes with Jeremy and our colleagues from Plexus International to the global supply chain.
All right, folks, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the road forward. That way we kind of know where we're going, because one of the things that I believe in is connecting the why before we delve into some of the technical tools. Now, the subtitle of this was Be Your Own Consultant, Weaponize Your Quality Team. So we're going to show you some of the tools and techniques that we use when we go on site in order to limit the variability coming up in the industry. But before we can do that, we got to kind of say what's ahead, say in the road ahead. So what we're going to do here is I'd like to defer to Scott here for a quick industry outlook on 2021 so that we get an idea of what might be in the future here coming into this next new year.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. The good news, folks, is as strange and challenging as 2020 has been to our global economy, we're in a much better place than we were during the Great Recession, where we saw that precipitous drop in vehicle builds of about 40%. Most industry forecasting services now advise the North American vehicle build in 2020 and beyond will be about 16 million units, plus or minus 200,000, which is pretty darn good since we went down to 9 million in the Great Recession. Bad news is there's an old saying that timing is everything, and the relentless spread of the first wave of the COVID contingent and attendant plant shutdowns that followed shortly thereafter couldn't have come at a worse time. Two things have happened. One, we've really depleted a lot of existing inventory of 2020 models, and we delayed the startups of 2021 launches because we couldn't get the plants running, we couldn't get the materials, et cetera. So now we find ourselves in kind of a perfect storm. We have robust demand, and actually it's been artificially inflated to drive the near-term deliveries and sales to catch up with the delays we've had in launches. We've had product sourcing constraints, both availability and opportunistic price increases. We still are under the threat of sporadic supply chain shutdowns due to the second and third waves of the COVID contingent going from region to region throughout the world as we look at the global sourcing dynamic that we all try to manage. And last but not least, the financial solvency and uncertainty of sub-tier suppliers, absent any government subsidies or backstop, really stresses out our ability down into the supply chain to make the cost or investments associated with raw materials, WIP, and finished goods inventory, not to mention labor and logistics, that we need to try to catch up and get ahead of this curve. So I think on a going forward basis, we can predict with unerring accuracy that those companies that have a more comprehensive understanding and commitment to mitigating the COVID-19 risk for and with their employees, specifically testing in the near term, a fundamental understanding of their bill of materials and how they generate margins and what the key variables are to be able to do that, and most importantly, can demonstrate better command and control of the manufacturing processes, will be able to optimize their throughput in the near term and margin realization. The other thing I'd like to point out that one of the other pieces that we're getting from a lot of your customers, I'm sure, is while they're inflating their demand a little bit, they're also on the fly reprioritizing your mix, trying to favor those products or platforms that are higher margin and more popular for them. So how do I get 120% productivity out of a line designed to do 100% if I'm supporting the new SUV launch or the new truck launch, et cetera? So I think that those companies that can do these types of things will be best positioned to successfully weather this storm until such time as we have a COVID vaccine, more importantly, robust vaccination rates. And the horizon for that looks to be mid-2021, end of the second quarter, start of the third quarter, before we see pervasive availability for the vaccines themselves, and we can get back to semi-business as usual.
All right. So the good news is there is something on the horizon for business as usual. The bad news is for the next 9 months or so, it's going to be up to us to weather through the storm. And so one of the things I like to do is I like to kind of separate what we can take action on and what we can't take action on, because Scott mentioned those things that are in your control and the things that are outside of your control. Now, I don't know who all is on the webinar, right? I got several hundred participants here. And I would imagine that at least some of you may be decision makers and some of you may have the decisions made for you. So what I'd like to do here is I'd like to just take a brief moment and I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the changing landscape in the world of work and especially in the world of manufacturing at this time. Now, we can control the things that happen because of us, right? But we cannot change the things that happen to us. So over here on this screen, so if you're not seeing my screen share, definitely go ahead and bring that up full. There are things that happen inside your organization, and there are things that happen outside your organization. Now, what you're going to have to encounter over the next time, and this is something that's going to ramp up more and more, we've got an increased competitive pricing coming from our customer base. Now, the other thing that's happening, at the same time as the customer is demanding a more and more competitive cost, we've got regulations and also consumers pushing for more sustainable, equitable, and responsible solutions. So notice those three things are on this slide, and they are all unique in their own way. A sustainable solution may be different than an equitable solution and may be very different than a responsible solution. So at the same time where you're trying to juggle the things that are happening internally to you, you're also having to compete with the consumer, requesting lower and lower prices for better and better products that have more sustainability, equitability, and responsibility attached to them. With that comes the increased stringency in regulatory compliance and conformity. So not only now do you have to deliver a product at a better cost that is more sustainable, but now you have regulatory agencies over your shoulder looking and enforcing, and a lot of times they call them a voluntary compliance. A lot of those voluntary compliance programs in reality aren't that voluntary. So there's a lot outside right now that is compressing an organization in. Plus, if that wasn't enough, sometimes from your customers, you guys are sometimes committed to year over year price drops from customers, right? They collectively shield that as what's called a give back, let's say. So there's a lot of things that are happening outside. Now, inside, we used to think, say, back in the 70s, as the inside of our companies as being largely, we can do what we need to do inside of our company to get the job done outside of the company. But that's no longer the case. Today's workforce is really now requiring a more competitive employee compensation. Now, that could be in terms of financial, that could be in terms of benefits, but notice that the workforce is also changing in their hourly landscape. COVID accelerated, let's say, the need for flex time, the reason that people may want to work from home occasionally. And we're also moving in a lot of industries toward contractor based models, which is I need engineering work done. So I go and I hire a contractor. So not only as an organization is your workforce demanding more in terms of competitive wages, they're looking for more flexibility and autonomy. Plus, you're trying to move toward a more contractor based model with modification to working conditions. The same way that we ran factories in, say, the 1970s is not going to fly today. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on. And one of the things that I kind of wanted to do is I want to go ahead and stop share on this screen. And I want to talk to you for just a second. One of the tools that helps when I work with being your own consultant and I work with organizations is what is called a SWOT analysis. So I just like to bring one up. And I'll promise you no death by PowerPoint, right, in this presentation. So I'm going to do a little bit of live draw with you here. So let me go ahead and bring this up. Before we go into the next slides, one of the things that I want to talk about is actionability, all right? There are things that you do have control over. And the tool that I use is a SWOT analysis, SWOT. Now, a SWOT analysis, for those that have been around a while, this is not new. You've got your strengths, your weaknesses, your opportunities, and your threats. Now, think of it like a quadrant. S and W are in one area. These are things you can control. These are your internal factors. Opportunities and threats are external to you. Now, newsflash, if you've never been inside of this situation, just because you didn't cause it does not absolve you of having to manage through it. When we look at strengths and weaknesses, these are things that you have either cultivated or that you may not be really good at. Now, on the other hand, the opportunities and threats, this is the changing landscape. From our previous slide, this is outside your organization. Now, what I want you to think about, the way that you utilize a SWOT analysis, you use your strengths to minimize the threats. There is a cross relationship. So if you have something that you see as a strength and you see something coming from the outside, you meet what is coming to the outside to minimize the threat. Notice I didn't say eliminate it. Newsflash, risk can never be eliminated. It can be managed and mitigated. It can never be eliminated. So we're going to use strengths to overcome threats, and we're going to use opportunities to shore up our weakness. So you really cross the quadrants in order to get to kind of a zero-sum game, let's say, right? You'll never be able to win, but you can reach predictability. Now, the purpose of this webinar is to talk about operating costs. And this is going to come into play here. There are going to be some operating costs that you have control over. There are going to be some things that you have some say in, but there are also going to be some operating costs that you don't. And the thing, as somebody that is focused on reduction of operating costs and creating a more adaptable, more, predictable operating structure, you're going to have to figure out what is actionable. Because quite frankly, coming up with a problem without a solution, there's a word for that. It's called complaining. So what we're going to show you in this webinar here, we're going to break down what the operating costs are and some of the costs you can consider in your organization. Now, we're going to assume that you've got a little bit of knowledge on here. So the first thing I'm going to do, we're going to go ahead and we're going to break down what an operating cost is, because there may be some people on this webinar that don't explicitly know. So operating costs, very simply, and we probably overgeneralized it in some ways, is the cost day to day to run your operations. It consists of things like rent, utilities, costs of goods sold, labor, repairs, travel, administration, insurances. A couple other items here. You've got direct labor associated with the piece prices of the part, materials, both direct and indirect. Some of those indirect materials will eat your margin like you wouldn't believe. Machine costs being spare parts and such. And then you've got tooling and machine maintenance, which could mean even technician costs. So going back to the slide before, notice here, these costs are largely inside of your organization. So what we're going to focus on is actionable, real world techniques that you can use to reduce those operating costs that are within the realm of your control. Scott, do you have anything on the big picture, anything else that you know that companies are facing?
Certainly, I think that the challenge of identifying, recruiting, onboarding, and retaining talent is a huge challenge and effort, particularly given the exacerbating circumstances around COVID-19 in general. But we know that we have every day in this country, we have 10,000 people turning 65. We do not have robust institutional knowledge transfer processes in most of our companies. So that ability to be able to codify and put the right tools in place and have command, be able to have very visible command and control of your processes and be able to share that in a higher level of transparency so we can accelerate the development of this next gen of talent coming into our industry is going to be mission critical.
I will 100% agree with that. Depending on which study you use at the time where you're reading it and which book you crack open, your average millennial will only stay with a company 3 years. So even if you onboard them today, you have to develop a way to bring them up to speed, have them produce within your company, and then find a way to, as Scott put it, codify that knowledge in a time to where when they decide to move on in their career, that you've got that added to your institutional knowledge base. Now, how does that, what Scott just mentioned, how does that tie in with operating cost? So when we go into a situation, Scott mentioned the Great Recession, and this is nowhere near that. Notice that most of us, and I do say most of us, will go with the quick win response, right? The easiest way to adjust for your operating cost is your labor cost, right? That is the quick win because it is easy, it is flexible, and it is similar to cutting your nose off to spite your face. it is actually a long-term detriment to the business continuity and your long-term success. Because when you think about it, we all have access to the same equipment. We all have access to the same vendors. Now with globalization, I can get the same, say, Arborg molding press delivered to any country in which we're actually molding. You know what the actual competitive advantages that the company has that is actually a large part of the valuation these days? Their intellectual property. And the intellectual property is driven by the organizational knowledge. So that quick win response, when we see a threat and we decide to cut labor, we're actually doing more long-term harm than we are good. So what we're going to talk about is how we can utilize the costs, being operational costs, without the words, we're going to cut labor, coming out of our mouths, because that is not the right way to roll. All right.
Jeremy, if I may,
Absolutely.
in the past, everyone kind of fell back to, well, we'll find these temporary employment services and we'll backstop, our changes on a contract ad hoc basis. Not a robust, sustainable solution. I can tell you from personal experience, I had hair, it didn't fall out, I pulled it out. But if you can get the temp employees to show up for 2 consecutive days and not steal something out of the lunchroom, and find places to hide them because they may be a danger to themselves and someone else because you can't train them fast enough, given the pressures you have to deliver product right now, it becomes a doomsday kind of a outcome, because you're gonna disappoint your customer, your quality is going to suffer, and most importantly, someone might get hurt.
Yep. 100% temp services. And I'll tell you, in these days and age, temp services are having people finding people to fill the spaces for you. Right.
If they can pass a drug screen.
Yep. Absolutely. All right. What I'd like to do, we've been talking a little bit here. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to launch our first poll so that we can interact a little bit with you here. All right. So we just talked about where an average organization, and I do say average because as a consultant, pre-COVID, let's say, I used to go into sometimes 100 different companies in a year. So I've seen it all, I've experienced it all, but I'm interested in your experience because I got a feeling you're unique, but not different. My question to you is, when it comes to operating cost reduction, where does your organization routinely look first? Go ahead, click on the poll. This is a choose one. By the way, I know how many people we have here, so the fun stops when I reach 80%. All right, percentage counter going up. This is interesting because we got people from different industries. We got people from different companies. We got people from different commodities. And I'll bet you that you're unique, but not different. All right. Let's go 10 more seconds. If you haven't gotten your answer in, go ahead and put it in there. And in 10 seconds, we're going to hit that number and then we're good. All right. And the show goes on. Let's go ahead and end polling, and I'm going to share the results with you folks. By the way, this is an all anonymous. So if your name's Robert, Robert's answer isn't showing up there. All right. So the slight edge out is direct labor, followed closely by reduction in support services. Now, so not only, now get this, do we reduce the direct labor associated with the volume, but then we take the maintenance, the calibration, the engineering know-how, and we reduce that organizational knowledge as well, leaving a huge gaping hole when the volume comes back. So the good news is you're unique, but you're not different. All right, good deal. We're going to go ahead and stop that share. Now, let's take a little look here at how we look at this in the next step. So I'm going to go ahead and close that out, and let's bring this up. All right. So one thing Scott mentioned early on is we have to understand the process. As a consultant, When I come into the organization, the first thing I do is I seek to understand the process. And unfortunately, when we talk about operating cost reduction, the first place everybody assumes to start is the manufacturing plant over here on the left. Now, the manufacturing plant in the current state model, which we mostly subscribe to, assumes that all deviations when it comes to operating cost have to be factors inside of the plant. But coming back to that SWOT analysis, in reality, there are very few factors that that plant can control. When you launch a job, one of the things you want to think about is your material costs, your transportation costs, your raw material sources. But when it comes to chips being down, we then focus only on the immediate pain. So what we're going to do, what we're going to be working on, I'm going to show you how to utilize what is called the future state model, a wider scoped line of sight that identifies as causes outside of the manufacturing plant that impact operating costs. For those that might be Six Sigma focused, this is similar, and I say similar, not exactly, to y equals f of x, right? There's always an output and it's always a function of an input. This allows us to lessen the impact on the plant resources by solving the issues where they actually exist and manifest. To this level, I bring you back, say, the doctor, right? If you're running a fever, we can treat symptoms, but yet if you only treat the symptom but not the underlying source of the infection, you're never going to get any appreciable relief. So an example of this in practicality, now we had to make it a simple example because we got hundreds and hundreds of people on this thing, is
Jeremy, just a quick aside to kind of embellish Jeremy's point. If you're looking inside the manufacturing portion of your business only, if you're injection molding, if you're stamping, if you're extruding, your cycle time is your cycle time. The worst possible thing you can do is try to play with your cycle time, and once you get your process centered, you can have catastrophic effects on the performance of the product for its intended use, from a quality perspective, but more importantly, from a performance perspective. And you can't get too creative with that. I can tell you, I'll give you a quick anecdotal story. We were in a material where we had a dwell time in an oven to cure the product. Well, the thought was, what if we jack the temperature up? We can reduce the dwell time and we get the stuff off the other end faster. That was great until everything exploded in the oven. It didn't work. So there are constraints you have in your manufacturing processes that must be adhered to make sure that your product is suitable for its intended use. So to Jeremy's point, getting really creative with dialing costs back has to be a much more holistic view above and beyond just that, because you're going to find there's not much you can do with your cycle time on some of these processes without a fundamental change, which is going to require a requalification in many cases.
Yep. And that requalification adds time, complexity, and cost, right? Because you got to re-PPAP that thing. Now, what Scott was talking about really when it comes to a lot of the components and a lot of that more holistic approach, as he put it, is following the bill of materials. On your screen here, you see follow the bill of materials. When we look at the green stuff, as Scott was saying, we're going to make the base of a stapler. Now, the green stuff are things within the manufacturing plant. You've got receiving, you've got riveting, you've got painting, you've got assembling, and you've got shipping. Now, to Scott's point, we can mess with the cycle time of these. We can try to crank that up. We can make some adjustments, but there is a point of marginal return, and there is a point where the risk of increasing the cycle time doesn't match the reward. What we have to do, and what we strive to do as consultants, look outside of the green stuff. What is in the transportation of the material? What is in the raw material? So if we take a more holistic approach to this, we've got the red stuff, which is our purchased material. We've got the gray, which is the transportation of the material. We've got the green, which is actually the manufacturing plant. And then out here on the other side, we've got the other gray transportation. So When we look at this is kind of how we should be looking at the bill of materials to try to see what is within our authority to move forward. So following the BOM is one thing that we do as a consultant right off the bat in order to look for operational cost reduction opportunities and sustainability opportunities. Because as Scott mentioned, you took that job at a certain margin, right? Let's say once all the bills are paid, you're sitting on 20%. Every time that thing goes through a step, it consumes margin. And so if you're not meeting the cycle times, the throughputs that you called out, your margin by the time it gets to the end is pretty much going to go to zero. And that's where we have a lot of pain. So the first step to look at it holistically, follow the bill of materials.
And Jeremy, let me give you a brief anecdotal horror story too. Transportation is an interesting piece because it's not as linear and straightforward as you think. We're talking about global sourcing. Let me assure you that if you source something from China, it's going to be on a boat for 5 to 6 weeks. And for 5 to 6 weeks, you can't touch that. So you're compelled to have cascading levels of buffer or inventory in your system to accommodate that product move. And then you got to pray that you've got the mix right, that you don't have shrinkage or loss. Hey, a couple of years ago, 10,000 containers fell off ships, to give you an idea. So perhaps in this case, if you really want to drive cost, maybe local sourcing is a very aggressive drive or campaign toward finding local sourcing to get that product, get you a lot further down the road than you thought. By the way, putting stuff on airplanes, give you an idea, from Shanghai to Detroit, it's a 13-hour flight. That's before you get through customs. And back when I had hair, my customers assured me that if I shut down an automotive assembly line, it was $1 million a minute, and they were going to give my company the bill. That's a 13-hour flight before you get through customs. So generally speaking, if you're looking at this global sourcing dynamic and you think it's a lot cheaper to get it from God knows where in Asia, you have to make sure that you take a long, hard look at some alternatives that might be a little bit easier for you to manage. And I guarantee you, you're going to drop a fair amount of money to the bottom line, not the least of which is reducing your buffer inventories, which and inventory is dead money, as most people know.
Absolutely. Inventory is another way to just tie up money and not make a dime on it. Now, that's an interesting point that Scott made. When we look at local sourcing, there is a current push to go back to a local sourcing strategy. And is the sourcing at times largely within your sphere of control? Absolutely. Now, there may be times where it is customer directed. That's a whole other thing. But a lot of times when it comes to operational cost reduction, one of the things that we look at as consultants is the overall value of the part. So, as Scott mentioned, this part you might buy in China for less, but by the time it goes through customs, you've got inventory, you've got travel. When you look at the entire cost of that part, it may be more cost advantageous in the long term to source locally. So, when we do this part, if we're manufacturing this particular base, some way that we work through this with the consultancy may look like this. When you look at the raw material of D.1 as a landed cost, it's 20 cents. D2 as a landed cost, 20 cents. This means when you put these two components together, you're up 40 cents. By the time you go into receiving, you've added another dime to it. Riveting and conversion into a finished assembly adds another quarter. Painting it adds another 40 cents. Assembling it into a finished good adds another 80 cents. And lastly, the shipped cost to the vendor makes it that $2 part. So if you're looking at becoming your own consultant, and if you're trying to solve your margin, the first thing you want to do is you want to follow the bill of materials. And the second thing you want to do is you want to assign the value to that bill of materials in each step. Now, this is an important technique that I'm going to show you here. This is one of them I'm going to go ahead and draw out. One of the techniques I use to do this, I'm going to go ahead and stop this share here real quick, and I'm going to go fire up another one. For those that might have been in the Six Sigma world, this is called roll throughput yield. And I'm going to make this a very simplified example. Roll throughput yield takes all the steps that it's got to go through. Let's say there are 10 stations. And in reality, for even a simple product, there are many more. And each station gets it right 95% of the time. So there's 0.95 at every one. If 100,000 units begin their journey into your manufacturing line, and it gets it right 95% of the time, how many make it out the other side with their profit margin intact? 95,000. And those go into station 2, 90,250. And so on and so forth, until at the end of a 10-station line, only 60% of your units have made it out. The rest of those units have had their margins eroded by operating cost due to poor rule throughput yield. Now, while that may be an example from within the plant, think about if we're going back
to jump in and understand, and at worst case, it's a teachable moment, and you could teach them what it really was and why. Thank you for your concern, but it's really not a concern. But those are the types of things that you can do that don't cost you a lot of money, but can save you a lot of money.
Yep, absolutely. All right. So, Scott, I understand that AIAG has a couple things that kind of help them along the way. You want to kind of go through the industry restart package?
Just quickly. So our objective as AIG, as a nonprofit here to serve you, the industry, is to provide you access to a lot of the standards, best practices, and tools. We start with a basic self-assessment in a lot of areas. The question is, what don't you know? And can I help you on this journey of self-discovery as you drive for continuous improvement? It's online, it's free. It's not a certification. It's just like, hey, and we want you to have the answers. You can benchmark your employee populations internally. You can benchmark externally. You'll see data there compared to China, Mexico, US, et cetera. It's there. So our take is to provide you literally free access to a lot of these tools so that you can help accelerate the development of this next generation of employees. We're trying to lay that foundational piece so you can spend your time with your key resources on those things that competitively or commercially differentiate you. Let me put it in a math analogy, if you will, or metaphor. AIG does adding, subtracting, dividing, and multiplying. Your teams do calculus. But you can't do calculus unless you can add, subtract, divide, and multiply. And I think from an AIG point of view, and based on our experience, we can provide that basic knowledge transfer at that level to free your constrained resource up to really weaponizing that knowledge with your employees based on, you know, what's made you successful through the years.
Okay. Now, to augment what Scott was saying there, we offer some things through AIAG and such, right? Open enrollment in public sessions, private delivery. So we can do a lot of different things, whatever it is you decide to do there. We've got design FMEA, PFMEA, APQP with PPAP. The trick is, what I want to get across here, don't let the way you think about traditional education and these tools deter you from utilizing them and seeking out something that meets your needs. Because you can either try to reinvent the wheel, or you can pick up on the tools that people have actually engaged in and utilized for decades to help you with this. As a consultant, it doesn't matter whether or not I'm solving a quality problem, a productivity problem, or financial problem. It doesn't even matter if it's a marketing problem. I will still use the same set of tools. I'll just apply them through a different facet. All right. That being said, we got one more poll here that I'd like to kind of go with. Scott, do you have anything to kind of wrap up today before we kind of call it?
No, we just greatly appreciate everybody's time and attention. Consider what you've heard today. We're here to support you should you need us. If you go to www.supplysafe.org, you'll see a complete array of products and services from AIG. We're an industry nonprofit. We've got 4,000 member companies. Our member companies are our strength, and we're here to serve you. Now, whether I can help you or get you to the right place to someone that can, that's what we do. And our objective is, again, more predictable manufacturing outcomes for you. And having spent a lot of time in this space, I know that given the current environment we're in, we certainly have a big challenge in front of us.
All right, Scott, you had one slide you want to kind of put at the end of this deck. So you ready
Sure.
to roll it?
Yeah, I am.
All right.
Looking at it as a guy who's run the businesses, This is what I see all the time as an impediment to continuous improvement. If you could see this thing, it is, if you're big fans of Ernest Hemingway and The Sun Also Rises, it's a shot of the burning of the bulls through Pamplona, Spain. The biggest thing you can encourage all of your employees to do is challenge the logic. Why are we doing it this way? And if you can see the tagline on this tradition is just because we've always done it that way doesn't mean it's not incredibly stupid. And I can tell you more often than not that typical response is, well, that's how we always did it. So yeah, but it's stupid. And what you want to do is you want to encourage or develop a culture where your employees are challenging the logic, even if they're wrong, and they will be sometimes. It's a teachable moment, so they better understand what we're asking and tasking them to do. But please, trust me when I tell you, if you want to drive improvement, something has to change. And the way you do that, as Jeremy started on this journey here for this hour or so, is you need to fundamentally have a much more intimate understanding of your processes. And once you can map those and understand where the pieces are on the board, admittedly, sometimes it's like three-dimensional chess if you want finance guys and purchasing guys and engineering guys involved. Nevertheless, it is challenge the logic, challenge the logic, challenge the logic. Thank you.
All right, folks. So last thing I got, if you're interested in working with us, check out our coaching plus training with Plexus, where we have sustainable knowledge transfer as one of our key offerings, tailored application, and we also do virtual seminars and boot camps. So if you liked this one and you want to spend some more time with me, definitely check that out. All right, that's all I got for today. All right, have a good one.
Stay safe.